Unfortunately, they couldn't attend today's protest physically, but have written a speech which I will be reading out. The impact of military sexual enslavement must never be forgotten, and the fight for bodily autonomy faced by marginalized people across the world will be further jeopardized by the removal of this important memorial, the Statue of Peace. The erosion of bodily autonomy is a crisis faced by many in our communities. It is laced within anti-trans rhetoric, in restrictive abortion access, and many other forms of oppression. We are all linked and in solidarity. We cannot allow the women who are forced and coerced, drugged, mutilated, and murdered to be forgotten. We campaign fiercely for the truth and must never allow the horrific atrocities enacted by imperialist powers to escape our collective memory. To those who have passed, we remember you. To those who are still with us, we hear you and we resist in your names.
We live in a world that constantly tries to forget, to undermine, and to erase. Histories are whitewashed, and the narratives of the powerful, the slave owners, the rapists, the colonial masters, are painted as heroic. Meanwhile, the victims of violence are rendered invisible, erased from memory, and their suffering reduced to footnotes in history books. We are here today because this is more than a monument. It is a living testament to those victims. It represents women who were violated, abused, and whose humanity was stripped away by systems of colonialism and sexual violence. These are stories that many would rather erase. We ask this question because monuments and statues have become battlegrounds for our collective memory. Too often we see statues that glorify oppressors, standing tall, while the few erected to honor the victims, like the Statue of Peace, are the first to be targeted for removal. This is not a coincidence. It's an intentional effort to sanitize history and suppress uncomfortable truths that these symbols represent. This is why we cannot allow the statue to be removed. To remove it is to participate in the erasure of women's stories, of women who have endured unimaginable violence. It is to participate in the continuation of colonial amnesia, a deliberate forgetfulness that denies the realities of the oppressed and allows the same violence to continue in wars and genocides globally. We stand here today because decolonization is not just about the past, it's about the present and the future. It's about creating a world where women's voices, particularly those from marginalised and colonial and colonized communities, are heard and uplifted. It's about ensuring that our history, our full unedited history, stays in the light so that the next generation knows the truth, even if it makes some uncomfortable. So today, we demand that the Statue of Peace stays. We demand that the stories of women who have endured violence are not erased. We demand that history remembers, and that the world never again forgets the price that women have paid under the weight of colonialism and patriarchy. To women who have survived, to those who resist, and to those who continue to fight for their liberation, we honor you. Your memory is our collective power. Thank you.
I'm so disappointed that I cannot be with you all today in person. The issue of Japan's military sexual slavery during the Second World War is what I researched after I moved to London many years ago. Over the past few years, I also traveled to different parts of the world, including Germany, South Korea, the US, Canada, and Australia to see statues of a girl of peace and other statues dedicated to the victims and Japan's military sexual slavery. I visited Berlin in 4th August this year to join the protest on International Memorial Day for Comfort Women, where many groups expressed their concerns about the plan to remove Ari and emphasized how the statue is important for the people and the communities in Berlin and beyond. Statues I visited in different towns and cities were successfully erected despite the challenges posed by the Japanese government and right-wing groups. The success of the erection of these statues, I found, lies in the support and reception of wider local communities, and this was very much the case of Ari, the statue in Berlin. While acknowledging the painful experience of those women who fell victim to the system of military sexual slavery, and making the Japanese government accountable for its past atrocities, as well as the lack of commitment to reparation. The local communities where these statues stand see the statue as something that symbolizes other cases of sexual violence and broader human rights violation and aspiration of peace and justice. That is to say, different cases of sexual violence during conflict, genocide, political oppression, gender-based violence, and many more. The event in Berlin last month clearly illuminated this. Ari is an ultimate example of such a crystallization of citizens' wishes for a better world, learning about and from the past, nurturing empathy for the victims, and attempting to restore justice. Removing the statue, thus, is not only ignoring the suffering of the victims of Japan's sexual slavery, but also is an assault on communities in Berlin and beyond, who aspire for social justice and a peaceful world. Unfortunately, what happened in past and what the Japanese military did to these women cannot be undone. However, the Japanese government must understand that it is not what it did in the past that it should be ashamed of, but the very act of denying the suffering of these women and the attempt to erase it from history by objecting to the presence of these statues is what it should be deeply ashamed of. The city of Mitte and the mayor, I was so disappointed by your plan to remove the statue. In 2020, the city clearly showed its support for social justice by rightfully responding to citizens' claims and wishes. Keeping the statue is a crucial reminder of the consequence of war in this time, intensifying militarism, escalating war and conflict, and acceptance of violence. I sincerely believe that Ari must stay where she stands now. She's a radical feminist from China.
作为一个中国人，我们从小被教育日本侵华战争为中国国民带来了很多伤害和屈辱，但他们对于慰安妇的问题却表现得很诡异。似乎他们去讨论那些受辱的女性会为国家蒙羞，他们只愿意用他们的苦难跟死亡换来政治上的筹码，但是不愿意去理会艰难生活的幸存者们。
Yeah, growing up in China, we were always taught about the pain and humiliation brought by the Japanese invasion during the war. But when it comes to the issue of comfort women, people's attitude, I think is the main narrative's attitude is a bit strange. It's always like they think talking about the women who suffered brings shame to the country, to the state. They'd rather use their suffering and deaths for political purposes than really paying attention to the survivors who are still struggling today.
今年年初，我去参观了台湾为了纪念战时慰安妇而设立的阿嬷家和平与女性人权馆时，发现他们有非常积极的为曾经被迫沦为慰安妇的阿嬷们进行积极的心理治疗跟生活上的帮助，我感到非常的感动。
Earlier this year, I visited in Taiwan. There's a museum called Ama's Peace and Women's Human Rights. Ama means grandma, in Taiwanese, which was set up to remember the comfort women. I was really moved to see that they're offering real psychological support and practical help to these women, to these Amas, who were forced into sexual slavery during the war.
但是在那个纪念馆的留言区，我依然看到一些令人心情复杂的话，于是我留下这样一段话。当我们讨论战时性暴力时，我们必须警惕两种叙事，一种是将仇恨转向外部的国族主义叙事，另一种是将这种苦难划分为过去时的历史事件。
But even there, I saw some troubling comments left by other visitors. So I wrote this message and left there. When they talk about wartime sexual violence, we need to be careful of two things. One is the nationalist narrative that pushes the blame outside, and the other is treating this women's suffering as something that's only part of the past.
但事实上，阿嬷们经历的性别暴力是超越了时间和空间的。在战火蔓延的今天，它依然存在。此时此刻，就有人正在经历着类似的暴力。
The reality is that the gender-based violence these women experienced isn't just stuck in history, but also now, today. It crosses time and place in areas where there's conflicts, just as other people mentioned in Sudan, Palestine. People are still facing similar violence.
所以还有另外一个叙事需要警惕的是，战时针对女性的性暴力跟性奴隶，并不是极端时期的极端暴力事件。事实上，这种暴力跟奴役是父权社会千百年来针对女性的性暴力跟压迫的延续，它渗透在我们生活的每一天，每一次侵犯的话语、眼神，到国家层面出面去拆除这些雕像，试图抹去痕迹。这些暴力就是从这些东西中滋长跟爆发的。
Another thing to be cautious is the idea that sexual violence and sexual enslavement during wartime is something extreme that only happens in extreme situations. In fact, this kind of violence is just continuation of the sexual violence and oppression that has existed in patriarchal societies for centuries. It seeps into our everyday lives, from the way people talk to us, the way they look at us, and even how government just try to remove this statue and erase these stories. That's where violence takes root and spreads.
因此，拆除这座雕像不仅意味着淡化我们对历史的记忆，也意味着我们对当下女性正在面临的暴力，置若罔闻。
So taking this statue doesn't just mean forgetting a piece of history, or history, It also means ignoring the violence that women still face today.
而我们现在站在一起，坚决反对拆除这座纪念碑，是因为我们需要它。我们需要它来铭记战争中的苦难，更需要它来唤醒今天对性别暴力的关注跟反抗。只有我们持续的发声，持续的关注，持续的抗争，才能让我们避免历史悲剧的重演，以及改变女性的处境。
That's why we're standing here today now to oppose the removal of this statue. Not only do we need to remember that the suffering of the past, but also to wake people up to the gender-based violence happening today. Only if we keep paying attention, keep speaking up, and keep fighting, can we stop history's tragedies from repeating and change the way women are treated.
There are established ways to actively silence and discredit people who want to bring it to light. South Korean survivors speaking out against the systematic sexual slavery of the comfort women system had an important role leading to creation of the memorials about sexual violence in conflict. Despite the widespread and repeated occurrences, there are hardly any monuments around the world dedicated to the millions of victims throughout our modern history. In Europe, there are only 7. Here in UK, there is only 1. Our stories focusing on victories or hardship of soldiers have actively suppressed that reality of occupation or ongoing conflict. In our schools, our history classes, we don't talk about it. In our politics, we don't talk about it. Amongst ourselves, in our families, we don't talk about it. Our society doesn't talk about it, implying it's not a polite or an appropriate topic. In recent decades, we have finally made a step forward to at least start acknowledging the reality by placing the memorials across the globe. And yet even these silent representations are apparently too loud. As in the case of Ari, the political influence and economic interest seem to be more important than acknowledging sexual violence is a persistent aspect of our society, and we should talk about how this is affecting us. The discomfort of the perpetrators is of a greater value than the nightmares that the victims need to navigate. Calls for removal are attempting to downplay the consequences of sexual violence or prescribe in what way we are allowed to acknowledge and remember the pain, suffering, and resilience of the survivors. An apology justifying or leading to an erasure is not an apology. Not even 2 years ago, London hosted a conference for preventing sexual violence in conflict initiative, where more than 50 countries have signed a UK-led declaration to end the sexual violence in conflict. Around 40 countries, Japan and Germany included, have also made national commitments outlining the practical steps they will take, and that included providing support for the current victims. So why are the elements of the Japanese government asking for a removal of the Statue of Peace in Berlin? And why are the German representatives willing to act on such requests instead of holding them to the required moral standards and reminding them of their obligations they have taken upon themselves? The memorials are not made or used to incite ethnic or racial divisions. Unfortunately, we have plenty of examples of sexual violence in conflicts, however you want to slice through our population. This is also not some sick competition on which ones are the worst. So yes, the memorials should be specific, and there should actually be many more of them to drive the changes we need. They serve many purposes, and one that we should particularly pay attention to is how the issue affects our societies now. Because this lack of discourse and concrete actions means that we're constantly resetting our starting point back to zero. Instead of discussing real accountability and justice for everyone, the conversations get derailed, drive a division, argue over estimated numbers of victims for each occurrence, shifting rhetorics trying to understand or sympathize with perpetrators, and have undertones of a constant, blatant dehumanization of victims and those who want to assist them. All the current conflicts have reported cases of sexual violence. A lot of them are systemic. In Sudan, there is a widespread rape, including gang rape, and many instances of women and girls forced into marriages or conditions of sexual slavery. Aside of social media, none of this information is in our news. There is also a completely ignored aspect of sexual violence towards people fleeing the conflict that leads to sex trafficking and other sexual exploitations due to their displacement vulnerability. In Palestine, despite the sexual abuse of detainees being by now reported by multiple sources and agencies, it doesn't get mentioned in mainstream media. In one of the most notorious cases in recent history, a gang-raped Palestinian man died because of his rape injuries, and it led to a public riot who freed the perpetrators. One of them revealed himself on camera, bragged about the rape on their national TV channels, and is being treated as a celebrity while the Israel state debates if raping Palestinians is legal. None of this has been reported in Western main media. For months prior, we have also seen the IDF soldiers looting Palestinian homes, posing in women's underwear, and shamelessly sharing these pictures on their social media, whilst on the other hand, we have people in power still spreading the now discredited lies of alleged Hamas rapes on the 7th of October, which along with the fabrication of the beheaded babies is being used to justify the atrocities against Palestinians. How can this be acceptable? And if you think for a minute that this is somehow related to extremisms of war, think again. This silence impacts our societies in time of peace as well. It shapes the overall attitudes towards women and allows a culture that finds pleasure in sexual humiliation. India has increasing numbers of disturbing reports of rape and gang rape, and many instances where these are downplayed or being prevented to be reported. Assaulted women are further threatened after the crime. The country has become infamous for sexual attacks on women. Rape causing death can be a capital punishment offense in India, but conviction rates remain low. The most known recent case happened in a victim's workplace, a hospital, where she should feel safe and secure, and where after finding her dead in semi-nude state, initially they were trying to deny sexual assault, telling her family she has committed suicide. Some days later, the High Court had to actually transfer the investigation. And we actually circle back to South Korea, where the history of comfort women is still being discredited. And we have increasing numbers of organized sex crimes through MOCA, and now deepfake porn crimes, where many victims and perpetrators are minors. Women trying to bring this to light are being targeted. And these incidents were not taken seriously until they started sharing information in English and sparked a global movement of information about the deepfake crimes that affect us, many people around the world, and display our shared outrage. Only then was South Korean government moved to make a legislative change. In this day and age, how is the importance of consent a contentious subject? And why do so many people believe that respect of body autonomy that is due towards another human being is something that needs to be earned or can vanish the minute when we don't agree with each other? How can so many red lines be crossed with impunity and no or minimal repercussions? We need to understand that a call for removal of Ari is not an incident done in isolation. It's a consent to knowingly silence a history of sexual crimes in conflict and preventing the needed discourse about what is happening in present. The history of sexual violence needs to be shared, and it needs to be now if we're really serious about implementing systems of accountability and consequences that relate to its eradication in our future.
The images and videos shared across social media showing the degradation of Palestinian men and women are not new. They are echoes of a deep history of colonial violence. We see this history too in Xinjiang, where Uyghur women are subjected to systemic sexual violence in Chinese internment camps. Here too, we see the hand of the state reaching into the most intimate parts of life to control and destroy. And if you look back to the past, to the Vietnam War, to World War II, the same pattern emerges: the rape of Vietnamese women by US and South Korean soldiers during the Vietnam War, and the horrific enslavement of young girls across Asia by Imperial Japanese Army. Forced into sexual slavery as so-called comfort women, this history is not dead. It lives on the bodies of survivors, and it lives on in the systems of power that continue to dehumanize and exploit the most vulnerable. These acts of brutality are the tools of an empire that has long viewed colonized bodies as disposable. We are here to make this problem known, to confront the violence that may have turned away from in the pursuit of our own comfort, their own happiness. But as Sarah Ahmed reminds us, if happiness requires turning away from violence, happiness is violence. We refuse that violence and that form of happiness. We choose discomfort because it reveals woes, the woes that our grandmothers endured, woes of pain, suffering, and resistance. Ahmed also writes, to become conscious of possibility can involve mourning its loss. Today we mourn for our grandmothers, the so-called comfort women, the Palestinian women, the Uyghur women, the Vietnamese women, the women of Sudan, Congo, Myanmar, and so on, who have been facing unspeakable horrors. We mourn for the possible past, where reparations were given, where justice was served, where imperialism and patriarchal systems cease to exist. In grief, we also look to the future, demanding justice and dismantling the systems that allow these horrors to occur. The Statue of Peace, erected to honor the memory of the comfort women, stands as a testament to this history of suffering. Beyond that, it is also a symbol of resistance. It reminds us that the comfort women issue is not a feminist issue, it is an abolitionist issue. It is a call to dismantle the very systems of violence, colonialism, and imperialism that have historically enslaved, raped, and murdered Black, brown, and Asian bodies across the world. As such, I'll read a snippet of Sarah Ahmed's text, The Feminist Handbook. Angela Davis, Gina Dann, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie call for abolition feminism now as being urgent and necessary. We have to fight to make what is necessary possible. I love how in their book Abolition Feminism Now, they do not just write about abolitionist feminism, but from it creating a living feminist archive of a movement that is happening now, urgent, necessary, now. Here is one of the descriptions of abolitionist feminism. We recognize the relationality of state and individual violence and thus frame our resistance accordingly, supporting survivors and holding perpetrators accountable, working locally and internationally, building communities while responding to immediate needs. We work alongside people who are incarcerated while we demand their release. We mobilize in outrage against the rape of another woman and reject increased policing as the response. We support and build sustainable and long-term cultural and political shifts to end ableism and transphobia while proliferating different in-the-moment responses when harm does happen. What I find so powerful about this description is how resistance is framed as a response to the relationality of state and individual violence. We have to find ways of responding that do not involve the expansion of reliance on institutions that cause harm, such as the police or prisons. This does not mean abandoning accountability, but demanding it. being inventive, creating our own resources to try and bring an end to violence. Killjoy activism is also about how we create and share resources, how we identify violence, including institutional violence, the violence of how institutions respond to violence. To turn to the police as the solution for the problem of gender-based violence would be to turn to an institution that targets many of us, those who are black, brown, poor, or undocumented. It would be to turn to violence as a remedy for violence. Killjoy activism would include the work we do to make the violence of the police more visible. Our activism thus includes feminist vigils. A vigil can mean to stay awake with a person who is dying, to mark or to mourn, to make a protest, pray, to count our losses, to count her as lost, or to borrow the name of a recent campaign in response to police violence against black women, to say her name.